Well, good evening. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Sarah Cornelli, welcome.
Thank you. Fun.
You're going to dance with me on this webinar tonight and around protecting?
Oh, yeah. Do a little fandango. Why not?
Sarah and I are very excited because for me personally, I know protecting really, really well. I've known it for the best part of 48 years, so I can speak well into this space in terms of how it's helped me and maybe where it's hindered me along the way. And I think, Sarah, you might have a bit of experience yourself in this space.
Yes, very familiar territory. And what I've discovered in working with people with protecting is what beautiful human beings lie on the other side of it.
That's right, just trying to access it through the prickleness that we occasionally meet. I'm also really excited to be here with Sarah because Sarah's heard me tell this story before, but I first met Sarah on the road between Sydney and Newcastle every Tuesday and Wednesday for about 3 years. And what I mean by that is many, many years ago, Sarah was recorded as part of a business interview cassette series as an audio cassette. That's how long ago that was. And I used to be in sales, traveling up and down to Newcastle, up to the John Hunter Hospital, and then later as a sales manager. And this particular interview had this lady talking about resilience. And the phrase I remember was, I fall down and I dust myself off and I get back up and away we go. And I remember that phrase distinctly because, in sales, you have to do that every single day. And so I had his voice in my head for a number of years. And fast forward about 10 years later, I'm sitting inside a TLC certification room and I hear this voice. And I go, I know that voice from somewhere. How do I know that voice? And then I hear this phrase, dust myself off. And I jumped out of the chair and go, it's you. I finally met you. And she had no idea who I was. So I had to relay this story to her around her voice and her story accompanied me on the Pacific Highway for many weeks. Over a couple of years of my career path. So, Sarah, glad to have you back and hear your voice tonight.
Glad to be of service, Pod.
So, for those folks who joined us in our Complying webinar a few weeks ago, we're going to run a similar process, which is this is really conversation between Sarah and I around protecting a little bit of the theory and framework, but more a deep dive in the sense of who we know, how leaders who have the gifts associated with protecting show up and how the extensions show up and how we might help them. So jump in and ask questions along the way and we'll try and answer the questions along the way or we'll gather them throughout the evening. But Sarah, maybe as a starting point, maybe just do a quick reminder of 3 key frames that we're going to use to frame our conversation tonight.
Yeah, so the first one, which everybody would be very familiar with, is structure determines performance. And here what we're really talking about, the structure of mind. So, this is beautiful illustration because it shows you structure in a physical form. And we're seeing that physical situation is influencing how that tree is actually growing. And so it's hard sometimes to really understand that beliefs and assumptions and frames of mind that we hold actually are a structure. So that structure determines the performance. And that's really what we're talking about, structures of mind and how they affect how we show up in the world.
And that'll come through in terms of our thinking, our mindsets, our needs, our beliefs, and influence our behaviors, our physiology, all the above.
Yeah. And that's the complexity of a human being, is because there's many things that influence that structure.
And then when we're talking about leadership, then the whole notion of consciousness, the whole notion of operating system leading into effectiveness. So how are we going to use that tonight?
Well, here we're really referring to, and it connects right back to that structure determines performance idea, because it's what's the level of consciousness, and that's what are we aware of, and what's the complexity of mind that we have. And really, in thinking about that, that's what's the perspective that we can actually take on a situation, because we have a narrow or small perspective that's going to affect how we can respond. Whereas if we have a capacity for a broader perspective that enhances our capacity to respond. So this is getting to the very issue of the complexity in our world, and can we actually be aware of the complexity from an object perspective rather than a subject perspective? And that's what determines our effectiveness, is it actually our capacity to see it and then work with it, given that it's object rather than subject.
The other thing with this, which when you and I were chatting through this conversation we're going to have tonight, the other kind of maybe twist on this is not just looking at this from the notion of the consciousness and the operating system of the person whose debrief we're working with, but also for us as the coach and consultant to be able to sit in their space and understand them, and then take that perspective and allow that to tweak or change or help us adapt our approach to be able to, so they are understood, and they feel safe and they feel understood because we understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, and I think that that's key. It's very hard to meet somebody in their world and be of service to them in their world if we can't actually step into it, understand what it's like, so we could almost in our skin know what the experience is like.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, we have the consciousness to be able to step out of that experience, not to be taken by it, but to actually be able to observe it.
Yeah.
And have insight into how to meet somebody in that place.
Yeah.
So that we're a traveller on the path with them, so that they can actually, through that process, develop a greater level of awareness, consciousness, and then therefore enhance their effectiveness.
Yeah, great. And then the last one, which you always try to do, it's so easy in these kind of webinars to only get stuck into the extensions of the reactive and the extreme of the reactive, and how to recognize that. And I think sometimes we forget to really understand the gifts that come with that, and how to help ourselves and our clients harness the gifts.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to think of anything in the reactive needs to come before the creative. So it's a prerequisite. So how do we understand that what we build and grow and develop because of it? So its existence is important and useful and valuable. In fact, it's the existence of any of the reactive tendencies that produces the skills and capabilities that go with that tendency. So they're actually developmental of their own nature, and therefore useful and important. But then when do they become overdone? And therefore they're limiting in their overdoneness. And so we understand that distinction. And in fact, it's really important to realise that the asset that lies within the reactive tendency is the very tool to help somebody develop an object relationship with it, so that they can actually see it in action, use it skillfully, rather than they're so subject to it that they're not in that position to do so.
Well, I love that notion of the precursor, that the reactive is a precursor to creative. And without learning or experiencing that, it's very difficult to lean into and develop the whole creative side. And it's another way of amplifying compassion, I suppose, or at least acceptance for who I am, and then moving towards compassion for who I am when I'm not at my best, or indeed compassion for my clients or colleagues when they're not at the best. So catching that as a precursor, I think is a lovely idea. It's a notion that I think we often underestimate, or we don't talk about a lot, but the reality is understanding and working with reactive means you've got an ability to move into creative.
I think also it's really important, because when you see a profile that has a lot of shading in the reactive, when I see that, I go, goody, goody, goody.
Opportunity. Evolution.
So it's like, that joke about the two children. They do a research study with two children, and in one room there's all these toys, everything you could think under the sun, and the child saying, yes, but they haven't got this and they haven't got that.
Yes.
Another child in the other room and there's horse shit everywhere, and the child's just digging and having a great time and saying, there must be a pony in here somewhere.
That's right. I just got to try harder to find it. That's right. And
There must be a pony in there somewhere.
Well, I think on that note, with the protecting it, I think it's worthwhile putting maybe a placemat down here. You know, the folks with high extensions and protecting, and you and I know quite a few of them, having worked with them and been them. It's a very sticky reactive tendency. It's difficult to work through. It's inherently to the DNA, and therefore having someone understand that the reactive is a precursor to the creative allows that compassion to naturally emerge, and it now allows you to try to truly understand them, make them feel safe, so that they got the desire to want to tap into it.
Yeah, and I think that whilst every reactive tendency needs safety, I would put an extra emphasis on people with the protecting tendency, because if we think about how we develop, you know, how this comes into being, the complying is the first way in which we, you know, in an evolutionary sense, the complying is the first way. So moving into relationship, and we're seeking to get connection, to get our needs met through connection. And if you think about a child, that's the first thing that they do. You know, they beam at you to try and get you to meet their needs. And you know, if you're in their beam gleam, you know, then you're just a sucker. But, you know, often in our world, that's not what happens, because children are put in separate locations and things. And so then the next thing that they do is they find their agency. You know, they start to cry, or, you know, whatever it is that they are mobilizing their energy to try and get their needs met. So usually first is into relationships, so moving towards, and then moving against is to, you know, try and get some sort of agency. And then if that fails, then, and if you listen to a child's cry, with that strange practice of control
crying, yeah,
that you can hear the desperation and the sobbing, and it's almost like the life force going out and the giving up. And so, you know, having to go within, and of course its original design was to produce self-soothing, but it is also, you know, from a child's perspective, it's traumatizing to some extent. So it's like, then it's going within and finding the resources within, and not reaching out to others for getting your needs met. Actually trying to work it out all on your own. And so, you know, what it is, if you like, is a failed attempt to get others to help you. And so not trusting others, not trusting that they will be there for you, is an integral part of it. And so
I was with someone last week who's come up in his career ranks through a hyper intellectual type career path in the insurance industry, and he uses the phrase, "I've moved away from X job or X person on a regular basis," and he even described it as moving away, like physically moving away, when you ask him about his career path. And of course, in his LCP, he's got huge extensions in protecting. I was fascinated by even the words, from Karen Horney's words from so long ago. That's the way he understood it. For him, it's a very active need to move away.
Yeah, and you'll hear that. I needed to withdraw.
Yeah.
I needed to seek my own counsel. You'll hear it in the language. Yeah.
So speaking of that, let's jump into protecting. So tonight we're talking about distance, critical, and arrogance, being the three reactive tendencies sit in protecting. We know it's an intellectual base. We know it's my value comes through my contribution intellectually, etc. But if we start thinking about leaders with, let's start with high extensions, and then later on let's come back to the gifts they may sit with lower extensions, or even during the times that the higher extensions are not there. How do these leaders present? So if you think about the underlying drivers, maybe let's jump to mindset first. In terms of what's the mindset that's driving some of the leaders with high extensions in protecting?
Well, I think if you think of the Enneagram concept of the needy mind, that's a really good frame to think about it. So, and if you listen to the description I was giving before, there is this huge need to be self-sufficient. So I don't need others. In fact, it's painful to need others, and by and large, others will let you down. So it's better to be self-sufficient, and I can handle situations myself. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
There's also a deep need to be private, and the privacy is that I don't want people to actually be able to read me, because if they read me, they will then start assuming things about me, telling me things about me, and I don't need that. And in fact, when people do that, it increases the feeling of the need for protection.
Yeah.
So that's what then they want their distance, So there's a whole how do I keep myself isolated from the connections that could undermine me?
And is that a fascinating starting point? Because if you think about from doing a debrief for the first session or second session, trying to work with a leader from a coaching point of view, I think most coaches will naturally want to have a connection quickly. And this leader may naturally want to not have a connection at all because it's scary. And even understanding that alone can be a useful way of thinking, or how do I set up my relationship with this person to suit them, not to suit my need as a coach.
Yeah, absolutely. These are people who you need to be paying attention to, how close they want to be, how distant they want to be, how they want the meeting managed. I find with protecting people, it's good to say, how would you like to do this?
Yeah. That's right.
And, often you see, they often test you quite a bit to see what's your character, what's your nature. Are you somebody that can handle their aloofness? Are you somebody who can handle their critical mind? And so often you'll experience some tests in that first meeting to see what's the caliber of who you are. And is this someone that they would feel safe enough to open up? And it can be even when you're doing your introductory questions and they'll say, I don't want to talk about that. That's none of your business, or that's inappropriate, being able to just meet them where they need to be met and not become goal-oriented with what you're doing. Just be in the dance of getting to know somebody who likes the dance to be controlled by them and delicately handled.
Yeah. And from being private, keeping my distance, and then the notion of expressing emotion, how do you find that comes out? Because if I am private, if I'm keeping my distance, if I don't want to share with you what's truly gone on, how does me express my emotion emerge or surface over time?
To me, that comes from being deeply interested to understand what's going on in their world that works really well for them.
Yeah.
And what are they curious about because it's not delivering what they would want it to deliver. And I think being curious about things on their behalf, because curiosity is something they relate to.
That's right. Yeah.
And even asking sort of bigger systemic questions that are more looking at maybe not the direct relationship between them, but the impact systemically when they're unable to enroll or engage people in the way that they want to, or what's frustrating them or limiting them in the things that are so important to them. And because they're usually deeply passionate, they really, really care, probably care too much at times about what's important to them.
You've raised something that's really bubbling through my mind here. One is connecting the dots One is asking people to open up in a way that allows them to do so. And the third one is caring. Well, I think one of the often misunderstood parts of folks who are very high in protecting is they care enormously. And they are often very sensitive people, and which leads to shutting down in some senses. But your point about connecting the dots, I've realized over the years of when we've gone through the kind of the context questions of family of origin and learnings through work, etc., asking the question in such a way that allows them to connect dots as opposed to allows them to feel threatened by your questions. Once they understand you're actually looking for a systemic answer, they're all over the questions and they're trying to figure that out themselves very quickly.
You raised something really important, Pod, which is asking questions. Because if you ask questions that for them feel forensic,
yeah,
they'll completely shut down.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's what they do to other people.
That's right. So they know how it's done.
So they are actually people who you need to have I think having composure is an important ingredient. Having courageous authenticity with them is important ingredient. It's almost like if you think about the near enemies idea, which I know we'll talk about later, but it's showing up with the awarenesses and the authenticity. That's the part of the creative half that speaks to them very strongly.
Yeah. I love that. We might touch back to that later on when we talk about coaching approaches.
The other thing here that's really important is because they're so attached to their mind,
mm-hmm.
being, I love that what you've got here, my worth is based on my intellect, analytical superiority, being unemotional and independent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that crystallizes it beautifully about what's so important to them, and that you're going to meet somebody who reflects that.
And then the irony of the word superiority, I love this about protecting. The irony of superiority, that it actually emerges from a sense of inferiority. So I need to show you that I'm actually really, really clever because I need you to know that, which causes an inferior sense of fear or drive there. And so I love the polarity between there's an underlying sense of inferiority that leads me to acting like I am superior.
And it's interesting because they're often not aware of that feeling of inferiority, that anxiety about not being good enough, not being accepted. It's almost like the way for me to be accepted is to be clever.
Yeah. I spoke to a lady a few weeks ago who's an actuary. So by nature, the fact that you're an actuary means you clearly are an intelligent person. You've been through a lot of hoops to get to that level. And her colleagues described her as very prickly. And just having a chat with her, she was talking about, sometimes I go into a room. As I walk into the room, I'm saying to myself, do not argue with this person because it won't be a good outcome. And suddenly I find myself arguing because, you know what, I can. and I can beat them in the argument. And then she walks out of the room going, oh, well, that was another one lost. but she...
Well, also that's the thing that they can do is they can rationalize that it doesn't matter. The very gift that they have, which is their mind, is the very thing that can work against them. And that goes to that stickiness thing that you were making before.
Yeah.
Point.
Yeah.
That what is actually their asset can flip very much into their liability in terms of managing the liability. So it's like the liability accentuates the liability.
Yes. Well, on the screen, on the first phrase here is imposter syndrome, which is a phrase you and I've used before to describe this. It's the fear of, I think I'm clever, but I'm not quite sure I'm clever enough, and someday I'm going to get caught out. So how do I protect myself against that opportunity?
Yeah, I think it's that often this dances with the perfect too. You see a dance between the protecting tendencies and perfect when this imposter syndrome is potentially there.
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, there is this sort of overdrive to prove that I'm smart and clever and I've got it handled. And it's also that you can rely on me,
Yeah.
like at the end of the day, you can rely on me. So, but underneath that, I always find it interesting to think about, what does it look like they're trying to prove? And, this is for any reactive tendency. What does it look like you're trying to prove? Because if you're trying to prove how clever you are, then what must sit underneath that is some doubt about your cleverness.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that notion you just said is one of the really important things, well, to understand for any particular tendency. But if you look at protecting, if the underlying doubt is I'm not clever enough or intellectually smart enough or able enough or whatever, and in the coaching session, or indeed in the reason why they're looking for some support, that comes out as the opposite. I'm trying to show off to everybody, and I'm coming across as being an arrogant, prickly person. Letting them be that in this session for a few minutes is actually very useful, because it allows them to experience safety. It allows them to experience the coach sitting there and allowing them to be that and not reacting back to them, and then helping them to unpick that. And I think I've found that the most important moments in my own evolution are the moments when someone has let me rant and rave from an intellectual superiority place, and then helped me deconstruct it afterwards, to actually understand, so what was that about? And I think from a coaching point of view, it'd be in some senses easy to be threatened by someone who's hyper intellectual, because they're smart folks. But actually, it's actually not about being smart. It's about how they're using that in a way that's not helpful.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, because if they're throwing out tests by being their kind of prickly way or aloof way, or whatever they are, and you're not fazed by that, it's like you're aware that there's a good person inside, that and that's who you really want to meet. It's like they start to become curious about you.
Yes.
And it's like you're a bit different. All my usual strategies that I can set the cat amongst the pigeons, and I can feel quite good about that. You're not responding, and so it produces a curiosity that, of course, is appealing to them.
Yep. I put some words on the screen here in terms of physiology and body posture, and I think they're relatively straightforward. I was working recently with someone who happens to be in South America, and the words they used to describe him in his qualitative feedback on page 12 of the report, the most common word was either Teflon or has no skin in the game. And he was quite shocked at that kind of feedback. And of course, his distance scores were sitting at 90 percentile. His passive scores were sitting at 90 percentile, so it was probably a protecting, complying pattern going on there. And of course, he's also extraordinarily strategically smart, and he's in strategic roles. As we did conversations in the group around, family of origin type conversations or my background, what emerged for him was that he had to leave his country of origin, which was Bolivia in his case, at age 12. And to fund his family's survival, so therefore going overseas, in which case was into Brazil. And then he moved, he's a very smart guy, he moved into jobs very, very quickly and moved regularly, and therefore learned that if he actually spent time getting to know the team that he was now leading, it may prevent him from leaving and moving on to the next promotion. And he needed that in order to fund his family back in Bolivia. So that led to this whole notion of distance, and it led to this whole notion of Teflon, or the word they used was no skin in the game. Once he understood that, he was able to shift that enormously and really quick. And I think that's one of the things about folks who are high in protecting is once they intellectually understand what's happening and they apply that level of intellect to what they want to do differently, it happens pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting to understand that intellect can actually work for you if you meet them really well. And often I find in the coaching, it is actually more about helping them connect the dots. And once they connect the dots, it's like, oh, wow. And then they're very hungry for how to do it differently, which is not always easy for them, actually.
No, no.
Sometimes they do already know how to do it differently, but sometimes that's a new kind of way of thinking and operating. I think the other thing is, you're talking about the, no skin in the game. They can also be so passionate that they're blind. They're blind to the impact that they have on others, and it's sort of like there's a slight autocratic, and it's connected to this being right,
Yes.
So
yes.
Because in my experience anyway, most people with the protecting tendency care deeply about human beings and whatever they're into. They care about it deeply.
Yes.
But they don't want to expose that vulnerability. So it comes off in this kind of rightness and righteousness.
Yes. Yes.
And when that's driven by deep passion, they've got too much skin in the game.
Yep.
Like they actually are not calibrating. And they think that they're, often they will rate themselves high on the creative, and others give them respectable ratings on the creative, but very high ratings on the protecting. And they're a bit stunned by that,
Yes.
Yeah. And they don't realise they're in overdrive, and it's the overdrive that is just a relationship breaking.
Yes, indeed. From a somatic point of view, you've used the word caring and sensitive, and sometimes the story, when you get people to tell the story, what you realize is there was a lot of hurt as a child in some way or other. That's manifested here. I have on the screen, the last sentence on the screen, hands fold across the chest or heart. I've just noticed from a somatic point of view, from a visual cue, sometimes that can be the cue. When you see them changing the position and there's almost a protection of the chest and heart using their arms, that gives you a clue on, well, suddenly we've entered into a conversation that's not comfortable. And therefore, how do you use that cue to help understand the question I've just asked or the conversation we just entered into? And then how do you use that to connect dots? Have you found that?
Yeah, I think they're fascinating because they often you have this feeling that they're frozen. There's a, and it's like they don't breathe very visibly. So when you're doing the what's at risk and you're wanting to get into somatic experience, they actually have difficulty identifying where it actually happens in their body.
Yes.
And so if you hit something that means they feel in their body, it's a bit of a shock, and they can get into distress. So there's a subtlety that is needed there, and in terms of taking them to places where they do start to feel, and being aware of that tendency to not want to be in the murkiness and the messiness of emotions, because once they go into that, then they start to get confused. So their clarity of mind is lost.
The word I have on the screen is overwhelmed. Overwhelmed when in contact with an emotion, which flips into denial or confusion. And anybody who's knows Myers-Briggs will know those. Anyone's got a profile with high N or high T, so NT or even ST, but the high T part, in overwhelm, it's the feeling part that comes through as the protecting zone or the secondary reliance. Which is also the same notion here from someone who's high in protecting, because it's intellectual. So intellectually you're overwhelmed. It's how do I handle the emotion of being overwhelmed that's now wrapping itself around me, and as you said, it's taken away from my ability to think.
You see this in a gorgeous thing that you often see, which is those hyper rational arguments that are irrational.
Yes, right. That's right. Keep getting more and more rational and going nowhere. That's right.
Of their rationality. And anybody observing can see, no, it's just lost contact with it. And that's often when the emotion has taken over. And but they're still using their mind as their defense structure.
From a coaching point of view, or from even a consulting into a leadership team point of view that naturally has a high protecting in the leadership team, one of the things I've done in the past is give a list of words like these words on the screen. And as an experiment, as a thinking experiment, have the leader to observe themselves going into meetings over the next 2 or 3 weeks and just watching for which meetings cause them to be on guard, which meetings cause them to be hypersensitive as they walk into the room, and not to judge it, not to analyze it, just to track it. And because you say it's an experiment, I want you just to be aware of this. Two things happen. One is they do it really, really well because the notion of experimentation and data gathering analysis is a core part of being intellectual in many regards. But the second one that comes out is they start spotting patterns very quickly. And I find they come back into the next session with a lot of clarity on at least the triggers of what's happening for them.
I think there's two sides. One, it can go that way, which I'm always encouraged by, but the other way it can go, because often the protecting tendencies are directed more harshly to the self than they are to anyone else.
Yes.
And
yes.
So what can happen is that they can get into deep judgment of themselves. So their critic is having a heyday with them about noticing it. So I think it's really important when you go into that observing exercise, and I'm sure you would do this, Pod, and I'm sure everybody thinks of this, but it's really important to frame it around allowing it, examining it. It's like a child looking at a beetle. How do you make it we don't need you to take your cat o' nine tails to yourself when you see this. It's literally to build awareness. You'll change it when you understand it because you're smart enough to do that.
Yeah.
But first is to actually see it in action and come to understand it better. And so go gently with yourself when you look at it.
That's lovely. I'm really glad you raised that. I've found over the years, the last 10 years, well, because Harry Potter has been around for 15 odd years, leaders who have got kids of the age of kind of 8 to kind of 18, they're all familiar with Harry Potter. And then you can use the idea of the floating Harry Potter books or the floating ghosts as a metaphor for when you are experimenting, you're watching yourself. It's a floating Harry Potter book. It's not the truth.
Yeah.
It's not judgment. You're just floating around and watching yourself, just so you can try and see what's happening. And I find that talks to both take care of yourself and don't judge yourself, because actually it's not all the truth, but also allows you to be relatively detached, watching yourself in the process. And it seems to land quite nicely, that idea.
I think there's another thing that you can add in there, which is notice it, and then when you reflect on it, identify what aspect of that is useful and what aspect is not useful, so that you're still keeping the connection to the value of it and not just, oh, it's terrible.
Lovely. So you're still playing to a strengths mindset, and you're still playing towards there's some aspects of this that are no longer serving you. Let's just observe that and understand it.
Yeah, I know that's true for me. I couldn't progress on some things because I'd see it and I'd go into such guilt and shame about it, that it wasn't useful. So I had to keep reminding myself. So how is this useful?
That's right. That's right.
Like, when is it useful? What's my positive intent that's embedded in this? So that I could just keep having a touchstone that took me back to it's okay to do this. It doesn't make you a bad person. Because I think that's the tough thing with the protecting. Everything that's done is really done with such a positive intent.
Yes.
But it derails, when it's overdone, it derails from that intent quite strongly. Like, it's paradoxically, it does the reverse.
Yeah.
And a little bit more strongly, I suspect, than the other tendencies. I mean, they all have that quality to them, but I think there's something specific about protecting that's different.
A couple of years ago, one of my former leaders said to me in front of a whole group, Knowing the organization gives me as much clarity and feedback as Pod does. So I really appreciate that. It's just I just can't sit down for 4 days afterwards. So, learn to give it a bit more gently. It's really valuable, but do it. Think about how you deliver it. And in terms of emotions, you and I've discussed this quite a few times in the last few years that we've known each other. This the deep care and longing for connection. I really think that's something that's really often misunderstood with folks who've got, if you think of high distance and the notion of coming across aloof and cold, it's not something we would think about naturally as actually this person may have a longing for connection. It's just that's not being overtly expressed.
Yeah, well, I think if you think about the way in which the protecting beliefs and assumptions get installed, they get installed because wanting to reach out, wanting to get, bring others towards you has failed.
Yeah.
And so underneath it lies, because human beings are designed for connection. We're completely wired for connection. So the fact that we act as if we're not wired for connection is to deny the deep longing that lies inside. And why do you deny it? Because if you open up to it, it will overwhelm you. And this is this sort of fear of the vulnerability. If I feel things as I really feel them, it will overwhelm me, swamp me. I won't have my mind, and my mind's the only way that I navigate this unsafe world that I live in.
Yes, yeah.
So I think when I understood that, particularly in clients, I'm still struggling to understand this in myself, but when I understood it in clients, and I mean, if I said that to them, I don't think I'd get an agreement. But if I hold that awareness and connect with them on that basis, it just constantly is confirmed for me.
Yeah.
That's something to be mindful of. And of course, the paradox is that they're typically cold, prickly, and apparently up themselves. So they're definitely not.
So welcome to the party.
Yeah, you want to have, deep connection. They're sort of things that you want to be cautious about. So, Of course, paradoxically, that's the thing, is that the underlying fear, if I do this terrible thing will happen. Well, guess what? By doing what I'm doing to protect myself, I cause the very thing that I don't want to have happen to happen. And, here it is in the protecting.
So speaking of connection and speaking of causing the very thing you may not want to happen, I'm noticing that no one has posed any questions yet. So maybe it's because you and I are having such a great conversation. Hopefully we're answering questions you might have, but feel free to jump on and pose any questions and we can answer those as we are having this chat. That's right. I mean, Sarah and I are having a great time. So if you're happy with that, that's fantastic. But if you have any questions, just pose them away. Just fast forward maybe one or two through these few slides. From a voice point of view, from a tonality point of view, is there anything that strikes you as being, a pattern or something regular just to watch for?
Well, often they don't speak. They kind of listen to everybody else and wait. So there's a waiting till they see the lay of the land and got all the data that they would work from.
Yeah.
Then I think there's particularly this deliberate. There's a very measured. You get this quality of not a lot of vocal variety or whatever. So it feels like it's coming from the mind. It doesn't feel like it's coming from the heart.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel like, unless there's a mixture of, some complying in there, or there's a mixture of controlling in there. But, in some ways we're doing this artificially because we're kind of speaking as if they were isolated and they're not.
Yeah.
But very much measured, considered. You can almost feel the neurons connecting as they're deliberating, on what they're deliberating on.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is that when they tip over into that sort of passionate, there's almost a driven quality to, what they're saying. And that becomes, there's a force in it.
Yes. Well, Dave Schrader, who's a colleague of ours in the US, he talks about, the intention difference between courageous authenticity at its best and critical at its most extended. Courageous authenticity is let me level with you, and critical is let me level you.
Yeah.
And the difference is the sense of cutting, the intention to cut you. Now, they both want the same outcome, but it's a very, very different approach. It's a very different pathway towards the outcome.
Yeah, I think it's the difference between a machete and a very fine scalpel.
Indeed. So there's a few comments come up saying that say that they're appreciating the conversation we're having. So no good questions. So let's just keep going. It seems to be working. Language-wise, I think we've touched on this. There's a whole lot of rationality, a whole lot of logic, a whole lot of non-emotional kind of language that comes through in this. I remember I mentioned that guy from Brazil who came out of Bolivia and who got a shock when he heard about having no skin in the game. And one of the things that he focused on for about 3 months was watching the emails he was sending, looking at the language he was using, trying to spot how often does he use an emotional word of any kind. And the first few weeks was, oh my God, everything is just pure fact, nothing else. And so he started learning a thesaurus just to learn some languages that he wouldn't normally use. And over about 6 months, it moved from hyperlogical to try to be connecting on email and reports to having talks with his team to doing whole of company talks to at the end of it doing a massive restructure where he was given a half an hour to talk about a dry subject called accountability. He got on stage and very visually in front of the whole audience took off his jacket, said, "Oh, I can't talk with this jacket on." Then took off his tie and then rolled up his sleeves of his shirt. And he said, I don't want to talk about accountability. I want to talk about trust. I want to talk about how you trust me to do my job and how I trust you to do your job. So let's have that conversation. And he talks from a real heart space. And something like 800 people in the audience, he got a standing ovation. And when I talked to him afterwards around what was so different for him about that, he said he often logically understood what he was trying to communicate, but never had put himself into the shoes of what does that feel like for everybody else. Yeah. And then once he understood the pathways, he was able to do it very, very well, of course.
Yeah, and I think that's the, what you're describing is the melting. The ice is melting. And the defense structure is gradually, I'd like to say it's a little bit more like peeling off the layers. And as the defense structure comes away, you get to see this heart-centered person that lies underneath all of that protection.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of watching it shift. And often I'm working with clients about their what do they imagine would happen if they revealed who they really were.
Yeah. There's a question coming up from Gail. Gail's asking, do they feel misunderstood to the point where it's too exhausting to explain? That's a really interesting question. I've got a thought on that, but can I ask you just to jump into it first, Sarah, while I formulate my thought on that?
So just say it again.
So do they feel misunderstood to the point where it's too exhausting to explain?
I'm not sure that they actually are conscious that they feel misunderstood always.
Yeah.
I think it's more that that's what's underneath.
Yeah.
I think often with strong protecting tendencies, they're just so used to doing everything on their own, and it doesn't feel safe to have your vulnerability in the world. So it's like you develop this way of operating that keeps you safe. And often for them, it's a real surprise that people would even be interested.
Yes, but they're being noticed.
What people really want to know that stuff.
Yeah.
So it's really a process of, that's why I think the melting is a really good metaphor.
Yeah.
It's dawning on them that there are other ways of being. And of course, this is like it's a softening their rigidity. It's not a flipping.
Yeah.
And I loved one of my clients. He got this book, which I haven't read yet, but it was so helpful for him. I'm trying to look for the title that I saw. It was something about here. Where is it? I've got to find it for you because it was so great, the title. Oh, wouldn't you know, I can't find. Oh, here it is.
Yeah.
Being Wrong, Adventures in the Margins of Error.
Being Wrong, Adventures in the Margin of Error. I love that.
Yeah. And this is really what we're looking at. I was talking to a client about this today. We just want you to soften the sort of 3% at the edges.
Yeah. Beautiful.
You've just got a little bit more room to move, and you're not quite so rigid, because otherwise you're stuck in a very tight frame. So I think, Gal, it's a bit more like that. I think it's also when they try to explain, they're not using the right way to explain. So often they need to be taught how to think about those things in a way that's appropriate. And
that's where I was going to go. I'm not sure it's exhausting unless they've tried and they don't know how to get the message across, and then they keep trying and it doesn't land. I think, of course, that would be exhausting. I think is once they find the safe space or the safe person to learn with or learn through, then it's actually quite a fast process of understanding, the development and the implementation of the ideas and practices. That takes a while, like it does for everybody. But I'm not sure it's exhausting per se, but more of how do they find the safe place of learning so they can get it, explore it, and then they move on fast.
Yeah, one of the things that I do with them is I have a sheet of feelings.
Yes, yeah.
It's a big sheet full of feelings. And I'm with them in the coaching session, I'm practicing them identifying what are they feeling and how would they share that with me.
Lovely.
So they're learning the language of feelings, and they're learning how to speak about it, because I can model. It doesn't have to be deep and meaningful and mushy.
Yeah.
Like, how can we talk about it as if it were a fact?
Yeah.
Which, of course, it is a fact.
Of course it is. That's right. Just different kind of.
Just flexing that muscle on how to talk about those things in a way that feels consistent with who they like to show up in the world as.
Yeah, lovely. Sarah, I'm mindful of time. I'm mindful that this conversation has gone really, really fast. We're going to share the slides with everybody afterwards. So if we've skipped over a couple of slides, don't worry, you'll receive that tomorrow. But I want to move on to an example, just so we can look at this. And then I want to, maybe to finish off, just talk about the protecting compliant passion as opposed to the protecting controlling passion, because there are nuances that are different. So this case study is a gentleman who's quite senior in IT, known for his sharp intellect, known for his knowledge, also known for his maybe frustration of people not working with him. His ability to work with people to get the outcomes wasn't strong, and therefore his ability to get the outcome wasn't strong. And I think you know this gentleman quite well. So I'm interested in a few things. I'm interested in how did he show up initially? What are some of the coaching practices or development practices you worked with him, and what was the outcome you got from that?
Well, he showed up, initially quite. He'd had a number of experiences that made him realize he really needed to shift something, because he was brilliant, like really, really clever. Mm-hmm. And the role that he had was inside an organization where the key strategic lever was their IT excellence.
Right.
And so he was actually brilliant, and everybody loved him because he was brilliant, but he was hugely idealistic and would get moralistic and righteous about the brilliance of his solutions, which nobody doubted the brilliance, but he wouldn't bring people along. And you can see that in the results. Yeah.
That word righteous keeps popping up, doesn't it?
Yeah. And you can see, look at that courageous authenticity and his systems thinker and his decisiveness and his sense of purpose and vision.
Yeah.
And good balance score there. You can see all of that. And then what undermines that, you can see down there in the protecting. Look, it's a classic, protecting, undermining.
Wow. Yeah.
And see the big gap that is on the people on the relating side.
Yeah.
See the big gap on personal learner and composure.
Huge. Yeah.
And then you can see a moderate gap on the achieving side. So it's like the question for him was, how is this limiting all of that on the top? Yeah. And the thing that he had difficulty with was this moral indignation that he had. And that became very interesting because one of the things that I got him to do pretty early on was to track the idea of, do you know that exercise, what I thought versus what I actually said?
Yes, indeed.
So I got him to track that. He was tracking his inner dialogue and then how he showed up and what his effects were. And what I really needed him to do was actually see how those reactive tendencies showed up.
Yeah.
And what their impact was. So it was a real awareness exercise, awareness. And he got, that got crystal clear. And then we needed to go into, so what goes on internally? So we're getting to the one big thing. We did one big thing. We did what's at risk. In fact, we did what's at risk a number of times.
Right.
But I'll share with you just some of the language that came out of what's at risk because I think it tells you. So the situation was when he would be triggered by anger and go into incredulity that somebody said such a ridiculous thing as what they said. And then he goes, aha! That's the behaviour, just as I suspected.
Yep. My righteousness has been validated.
Yeah. And then he would say, this will run away. It'll get out of hand. It cannot be permitted to continue. And it really came down to we will fail. If this sort of thinking is allowed, we will fail.
Yeah.
And it's his job to protect people, but if he lets this happen, he can't protect the people, and it's going to cause this rise in error rates, and everything that shouldn't happen will be allowed to happen. And it was just, I cannot possibly allow this to happen because then I will be complicit in the failure of everything and everybody.
And what's fascinating about that dialogue you just had, on one hand, is the whole righteousness of being validated in my thinking, but the other one is I want to protect people, and the concern's been driving from I want to protect people, and I can see what good looks like, and we're not there, and I'm concerned about protecting people.
Yeah.
But most of us don't hear or see that. What we hear and see when the leader's in full flight is you're all idiots, and I'm the only one who knows best.
Yeah, and he was feeling, actually in that moment when that happened, when we went underneath, he was feeling helpless.
Right.
And that it was just like if he didn't step in and do whatever it took. And I said to him, so what are the beliefs that you've got running there? He said, the strong should protect the weak.
Wow.
The duty to protect others.
Yeah.
I can't trust people to honour the essence of me. People can't be trusted with the essence of me.
Wow. Okay. So huge belief patterns.
Yeah, and that really, I found that this kind of crystallizes for me what happens when people have these and you can hear I'm getting shrill because that's the way he was.
Yeah.
So compulsive energy. And so what we had to do was actually help him manage that anxiety and that stress, and that, like, it was physiologically a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did a lot around vagal breathing.
Okay.
So vagal breathing is about, you take a breath in and then you breathe out very slowly. So the out breath is much longer than the in breath.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did lots of different somatic things so that he could actually manage the intensity of the experience, because it was a full physiological crisis.
Yeah.
So a lot of work on that. Look, I had a huge list of things that I did with him in terms of working through it. We did lots of somatic work, lots of evidence seeking. So what's the behavior? What's the results?
Yeah.
What are the beliefs that are driving the behavior? Lots of reframing. I mean, we came at reframing every time he got triggered, and the reframe that he had wasn't using. We looked at what was another dimension to it. What was another dimension to it? And there were multiple dimensions to it. We did a lot around the drama triangle and the winning triangle using Karpman's model.
Right.
And
right.
with protecting, if they're struggling, I often use models. So I give them a model, a very simple model, but then I get them to live it experientially.
Yeah.
They somatically experience the model in action.
Well, what I love about this this process is it goes to the integration of a whole range of modalities to help this person overcome a lifetime of mindset development.
Yeah.
And had you not, if you were only using one or two, you might have got so far, but he would have got bored very quickly, I suspect, and he wouldn't have got the results that you needed to get. But by coming at it physiologically, somatically, conceptually, and in a range of models, allowed him to play and experiment and recheck back in with you on a regular basis.
Yeah, and we did a lot of skills development around how to make I statements, how to speak about your feelings. We did how to apologize, how to repair relationships. So giving him permission for it to go wrong, but then cleaning up the mess afterwards. So how to do that in a way that was very dignified, that held on to his authority. So we did a lot around when is vulnerability strength and when is vulnerability weakness, and how can you distinguish the difference between the two. So lots and lots and lots of work on differentiation. We did stuff on conflict management. Oh, that's right. He had a complete allergy to politics.
Oh, right. Of course it is, because it's not pure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So we actually did a whole lot of work on what's the difference between negative politics and positive politics?
Yeah.
And what happens if you refuse to play in either?
Yeah.
And that was really great for him, because he discovered that he was abdicating power by not engaging in positive politics.
Yeah.
And so that offended him from a moral perspective.
Yeah, and therefore he wasn't able to fulfill his duty.
Yeah.
Sarah, and if you could,
pages. I've got pages of things.
I bet. I'm going to extend this maybe for 5 more minutes, because we promised we'd finish at 8, but I think we're in the middle of some really interesting stuff, and I see some questions popping up on the screen. So for Tracy, yes, this has been recorded and will be available from later on this week, and the slides are available. So anybody who joined late, you'll have full access to this later on this week. Kerry, you've asked a question around: is protecting behavior common or to be expected with technical experts, example IT, actuaries, lawyers, and I'm going to say doctors, quality assurance, financial control? And the answer is, and Sarah, please jump in here as well, but if you think about protecting as being an intellectual based self-defense mechanism, people who come up through intellectually based career paths then naturally develop this. So if you think about a litigation lawyer whose job is to debate and prove that the opposition is wrong, then naturally you're going to learn the whole protection around intellectual arrogance and criticality. It's a natural part of your training, in fact, and whether your training or your personality suits each other, but it certainly goes alongside each other. So you certainly would see folks who have got career paths that are intellectually based may well have a degree of protecting.
I would say it's more what's in their story.
Yes. Yeah.
And if in their narrative there is something that activated the protecting as a strategy, then they're going to gravitate
towards a career path.
To a career path that supports that.
Yeah.
The other thing is that I think about a little bit in terms of the different stages of adult development, that you can actually get a bit stuck, and so not so much in the Kegan's model, but if you look at Susan Cook-Greuter's and you talk about the expert,
yes,
you can get stuck in the expert, and so that's a reactive frame, the expert frame, and of course it will have a lot of these protecting, and to some extent because it often works as protecting controlling, protecting complying. But
my last question for us tonight is actually just to talk about that, the pattern of protecting complying that's different to the protecting controlling. And of course some of this initial work came out of Karen Horney's work way back when, but from your experience there, how does that show up in terms of an LCP profile? What would we have to look at first to see where the pattern might be emerging, and then what does it mean from the work we do with the person?
Well, I mean, we could almost do a whole session on patterns.
Maybe we will.
Yeah, there is so if you look at the correlation tables, there's actually a strong correlation between protecting and controlling.
Yep.
So if you tend to see protecting and controlling a lot, as we're seeing here in this particular profile, that's to be expected. They kind of go together.
Yep.
You also see a pattern with complying protecting, but it tends to be more the complying and distance.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, in the minute I've said that, you'll see variations on the theme. But it's the critical, when it's present, is often self-directed, not necessarily so other-directed.
Yeah.
Or it can be critical is there in the person's thinking, but it's not showing up in their behaviour. So you'll see a self-rating high and another rating low.
Yeah.
So that's often with the complying. And then, of course, you get another pattern, which is where, and in fact, with this particular person, after when we did the retake, a whole lot of complying showed up and the controlling went down. And what he was doing was trying to manage the controlling by complying.
Yes.
And so this is what you can often see, that they move around the reactive structure trying to resolve the tension instead of actually growing up into the creative.
Yeah.
So just a couple of comments on it. I mean, this one was very interesting because you can see there's a shadow relationship with the complying tendencies there, because his own ratings are below the 10th percentile. And even his belonging is on the line. So that became interesting because we actually did do some shadow work, and that's when he opened up to the complying tendencies, which in his case was very helpful because he started to connect much more with his heart through that.
Right. And actually, maybe as a final comment then, you've lovely segue, the notion of heart, the notion of compassion, well, what are your thoughts around that, specific for working with leaders who are naturally high in protecting?
Well, the big thing really, first of all, you have to hold space for them in a very particular way. That is both an open heart and an open mind.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that, to me, it's very hard for them to progress until they start to have some compassion for themselves.
Yeah, I love that.
And with the fellow whose case that I had up there, we did some chair work. In fact, with the guy that I was working with today, we did a mini version of that, where we looked at the little boy who learnt all of this. And he learned it really well because his circumstances required him to learn it really well. And he learned it so well, he succeeded brilliantly.
Yeah.
And so we separated him as the man and him as the little boy. And I got him to sit in the chair of the little boy and asked the little boy, what was he longing for? And he could identify the little boy was longing for recognition, that he had his own voice, that he was appreciated, that he was held in high regard. And what I worked with him then was, look, you didn't get it from the source that you wanted it from, but you can get it from yourself now. And so working with this idea of how could he recognize that when he went into these compulsive protecting tendencies, was that little boy longing for what the grown man could give him. And so for him, that's been incredibly helpful to soften his otherwise harshness on himself. And with that softening, he's actually able to be more in his heart with other people. So, and in fact, interestingly, he's chosen relating as his primary area to work on. Yeah. And because he could really connect to the longing in the little boy to be treated with high regard. And he just could wake up that he wasn't treating people with the very thing that as a little boy he was longing for.
Yeah. It sounds like a David Whyte, the English poet. You know, what's the longing that's stalking you that's got no right to leave you? And you're able to access that longing, understand the longing. It does go to answering those questions in terms of how do I get closer to me, to my own heart, and access that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lovely. Sarah, speaking of voice, you and I have used our voices for a lot tonight. We're way over time. And I think it's because we both love this area and we know it so well from our own experiences. But hey, thank you for all of your wisdom and all of your input. There's been a lot of comments coming through about the style of session that we've run. So people seem to be enjoying that. So glad you're enjoying that. Our next one is on May the 1st. And that's going to be a deep dive into controlling. I suspect, given the topic, we will finish exactly at 8 o'clock because that's what you do when you're high and controlling. So we'll see that. But certainly, Sarah, lovely to have you here tonight. Your voice hasn't changed since those cassette tapes we've had years ago.
A lot of people say I haven't changed much.
You're getting closer and closer to you. That's the idea. And just as a final maybe comment, you'll all will be receiving information last week and over the next couple of weeks. But we're very excited about our May 17th conference. As you all know, we've tweaked the format a little bit to be able to bring in some really true world-class speakers and have a day-long conference. But keep an eye out for that information, and can't wait to see you in Sydney for that. Thank you, everybody. Good night.